I'm going to talk today about a very elusive figure in the history of 20th century American design. A man who, very much like designers today, worked in many different fields. He was very well known, Bill Geddes, as a theater, Broadway set and costume designer in the 1920s. And then he becomes a well-known industrial designer in the 1930s. And the 1930s for Bill Geddes culminate in the 1939-1940 pavilion that he designs for General Motors at the 1939-40 New York World's Fair. And it's unquestionably the most, because of the client, General Motors, the most Michigan-based commission that Bill Geddes ever received. But it's also the one that had the greatest national scope, in that it is probably the most persuasive model to have convinced Americans to go with the automobile and to accept a very autocentric America. Bill Geddes is elusive because, unlike some of the designers we've seen in the Michigan Modern Exhibition, people like Charles Eames or Eero Saarinen, who created well-known, iconic pieces of furniture that are still manufactured, Bill Geddes' most famous project, the Futurama, was like a theatrical presentation. It was temporary. And all that's left now are a series of very important photographs, and its impact is still with us very, very much. The main part of Futurama was an enormous model, which you see on the right of the screen, in which, like a play or like a movie in many ways, people sat in chairs on conveyor belts and flew around the model, swooping down sometimes for close-ups and swooping up sometimes for grand sort of long shots or aerial views. It was very theatrical, very cinematic in many ways. What they saw in this extraordinary model in 1939 was America 1960, in which people traveled across the country on what would become, some years later, the interstate, and they drove in air-conditioned, futuristic, streamlined automobiles. So today I'm going to focus on Futurama, and as you'll see it on the right, but I'm also going to look at Bill Geddes' oftentimes failed attempts to create automobiles. Some of those automobiles were relatively possibly going to happen, but they didn't. He worked for real Michigan-based companies, and some of them, as in all of Bill Geddes' cases, were fictional or visionary. He went back and forth with considerable ease from the real to the visionary to the fictional. The story of Futurama begins in the mid-1930s. We see Norman Bill Geddes here on the left with his second wife, Frances Waite. He had married a woman named Belle Snyder. That's where he gets the Norman Bell Geddes. He uses her first name as his middle name. He was actually born Norman Geddes. He divorces her in the mid-20s, gets rid of the woman, but he keeps the middle initial. He also drops, in addition to the woman, he drops the hyphen that he had used under Norman Bell. He becomes Norman Bell Geddes. They divorce in the mid-20s, and for those of you of a certain age, yes, Barbara Bell Geddes is his daughter. In the late 20s, though, he is introduced to a woman named Frances Waite. And this, as Martha Stewart would say, is a good thing, because Frances Waite, who we see here, is the niece of Stanley Resor. And Stanley Resor is the head of the J. Walter Thompson advertising agency. And in the early 30s, he marries Frances Waite, and through her connections, through her uncle, Stanley Resor, it really opens the door to a series of extremely important projects, ultimately leading to the Futurama exhibition that General Motors commissions from him. On the right, in the image, you'll see the J. Walter Thompson advertising agency, which is in the Gray Bar building in New York, which was one of the sort of chicest buildings. It's still there. It rises above Grand Central Station. Condé Nast's offices were there at the time. And Bill Geddes designs their offices through the intercession of Frances Waite. And in typical Bill Geddes fashion, he says, I'm not designing a functional space. I'm designing a theatrical space. This is a stage set in which business is presented to its clients. So in other words, from the beginning, even when he's doing sort of interior design work, he is seeing it in a very sort of theatrical terms. In the mid-1930s, J. Walter Thompson gets the commission to sell a new kind of gasoline that Shell Oil is going to produce. And Bel Geddes, again, always very virtuosic and always never doing what the client wants. He's hired to do an ad campaign, but he decides to do a city of the future. And somehow he convinces J. Walter Thompson and Shell Oil that this is a good idea. And here we see Norman Bel Geddes playing God with a sort of a map or a model, what seems to be Lower Manhattan. And he's planning his city of the future. So here's a man who's been a theatrical designer in the 1920s, and an industrial designer in the 1930s, and suddenly in the mid-1930s, he's becoming an urban planner. It's most interesting to know that when Architectural Forum magazine publishes this project, which is a city of tomorrow, they don't mention that it starts as an ad campaign. They treat it as if Norman Bel Geddes is actually presenting his idea of the future city of America. The resulting model, which you see here, was built in Manhattan, and as you'll notice, automobiles are very, very prominent in its display. It's a series of multi-level highways that cut through the city. The great urban planner and impresario of New York, Robert Moses, is in the mid-30s proposing regional road systems that will become the interstate system in the 1950s under Eisenhower. But Bel Geddes is presenting them in these very theatrical, extremely compelling ways. And it was mentioned yesterday in the presentation on Balthasar Korab that oftentimes in the Aerosarnen office, smoke would be blown into the models to give a sense of the atmosphere. The same thing was done here. So the model is built in a model shop in Manhattan, and smoke is blown into it to create an atmospheric effect as if it's a real interior, a real cityscape. And this is the ad campaign as it appears. So this is the city of tomorrow, and you'll notice that by this point in 1930, I'm trying to see when this is 1938. By this point, Norman Bel Geddes is so well known that Shell allows his name to be given larger than their name. The way it's depicted is Shell Oil is bringing you a new gasoline today, which will help cars not have to start and stop. So it's a better gasoline. But what we're really doing at Shell Oil, we're solving your immediate problems now, but we're also thinking about how we're going to really solve the problem. And solving the problem really is going to be an interstate, large, multi-level highway system cutting through our cities so there will no longer be any stop-and-go traffic. And this is how it's pitched. So it's basically selling a gasoline, but it's sold in this bigger, grandiose theme with Norman Bel Geddes as its primary spokesperson. Now, General Motors must have seen this because some of these campaigns, some of the advertisements are taking place in magazines like Life magazine. They're taking place in the Saturday Evening Post. They must have known of this. So in the later 1930s, around 37, 38, they hire Albert Kahn, the great designer of automobile factories, but they really hire Norman Bel Geddes to give their vision of the future. The exhibition is called Highways and Horizons, and the centerpiece of it is the Futurama, which is this amazing structure which is built in Queens, in New York City, in the late 1930s. Interestingly, Bel Geddes had worked for General Motors a few years earlier. In 1933, he creates this beautiful medallion that was done by Bel Geddes in a streamlined style to commemorate the company's 25th anniversary. So General Motors knew of him, but I think it's the big campaign, the J. Walter Thompson campaign, that actually brings him tremendous prominence. Now I want to show you, this is an enormous panoramic photograph of the Futurama building. In the distance is the pylon, the Trilon and Perisphere, which were the sort of symbols of the fair. And right behind the Futurama exhibition, it's hard to see, but there's a road that has been built. It's now a road that's in New York that connects Manhattan to the highway, to the airports. And this is a road that Robert Moses has actually built to bring people to the fair. So in other words, right outside the Futurama building, the road systems of America, the national road systems that we live with today, are starting to be built. But what's happening with Futurama is, as I said earlier, Bill Geddes is really giving it its most compelling form. He's really doing the persuading that this is a good idea. Here is a photograph of the Futurama building. This is usually shown to depict how many people went through it. Notice the lines of people snaking up into it. And they went into a kind of a crevice, a dark slit in the building, very dark, and then they entered onto the model base. This is, maybe you can see it, there's a man standing sort of on the upper left-hand corner. That is Norman Bel Geddes standing with the blueprints. This is the model itself in pieces, which was built for the Futurama exhibition. Overall, it was 4/5 of an acre when it was done. It took 180 craftsmen to build it. There were 500,000 individually designed buildings, and there were 1 million trees. Cars and roads were a major, major component of it. It's what links the vision as you're flying across this America, 1960. Here we can see workmen working on the various components of the model. We can see an automobile interchange in the second to the left image. And then we see it, like at the J. Walter Thompson Shell Oil campaign, we see it slicing through the modern city. Futurama model also included an airport. Bel Geddes was never interested in one mode of transportation. He was also always interested in a kind of ecosystem of transportation in which cars, trains, planes, etc., buses would all be linked together, what today we call multimodal travel. Across the Futurama model, you would see that. So when you look at this, this is the airport that you'd see in the model, but you also see automobiles and you see trains. Now, all of this information, this 4/5 of an acre model, was given to the viewer in the most theatrical imaginable experience. Overall, this is, by the way, is a photograph by Margaret Burke White, who, you always know great photographers are great when they capture the right image. She gets in this photograph exactly what's going on. You entered a kind of a map hall when you went through that slit, and then you got on a moving conveyor belt. You sat in little seats that encompassed you in 6-foot-high blue mohair, and you flew over this model. The chairs actually on the moving conveyor belt not only moved horizontally, but they moved vertically. Overall, they moved a total of 23 feet in elevation changed. So in other words, at times, they went down close, and then they would pull back up to give you a panoramic view. The whole path was a kind of a figure 8 that went across the model, and you traversed a third of a mile. And on this conveyor belt moved 2,000 people per hour, 28,000 people per day. Futurama was without question the most popular exhibition at the fair. It was seen by 5 million people in the fair's 2 years. As I said earlier, each chair enveloped the viewer in a kind of blue mohair upholstery, kind of a cocoon that rose above your head. And one of the great things about, one of the most innovative aspects of the fair, of this event, was as you were moving, you heard a narration, you heard a voice. Each person would have to have the voice be slightly different, timed to what they were actually seeing. So there was an elaborate sound system that was developed so that everybody was hearing simply what they were looking at. It was timed specifically for them. This was without question a major presentation made by Bel Geddes to convince people to go modern and to form a new America. Now, we need to step back a moment. So that's the Futurama. I need to step back a little bit and talk about Norman Bel Geddes himself. As I mentioned earlier, he was born Norman Geddes, and he would later change his name, taking his first wife's. There were a total of 4 wives. The last 2 were kind of short. But the first wife was Belle Snyder, and he takes her middle name. He takes her first name as his middle name. He was born in Adrian, Michigan in 1893. His mother was a Christian Scientist. And Christian Scientism, as many of you know, is a religion of kind of mind over matter. At the same time, Bel Geddes was very interested in things like theosophy and certain kinds of religious ideas having to do with transformation. There's political science, there's Christian Scientism, and his library, which is at the Ransom Center, is filled with books about advertising, another form of persuasion. So he's very early on interested in design as a mode of transformation. Design will make our lives more intellectually rich, more emotionally rich, and physically better. And this is imbued in him by his mother's religion, by his love of American advertising, and the spirituality in which he grows up. These are all kind of transformative experiences. He also, so that's his family on the upper left. On the lower left is him as another master of persuasion. He becomes a boy magician, and he dubs himself Zetsky, the boy magician, and he gives performances. So you have Christian Scientism, theosophy, and good old-fashioned American advertising and magic all combined in this man. He has virtually no education. He takes a little bit of schooling. He's totally self-created and self-taught. In around 1914, he gets himself to Los Angeles, and he works with Aline Barnsdall, who, as you may know, desires to bring art and architecture and modernism to Los Angeles. And she commissions Frank Lloyd Wright to do what is now the Barnsdall House. And Bel Geddes goes there to design theater sets for Aline Barnsdall. Frank Lloyd Wright is the architect of the complex. Bel Geddes does do some theater designs, and he thinks he's going to get the commission to design the theater. But one major ego bangs into another major ego, and Frank Lloyd Wright says, "No, I'm doing the theater." So at that point in 1917, Bel Geddes has now become very, very frustrated, and he moves to New York City in 1917. And New York, like America in 1917, is a city that is about to enter the world stage. The First World War has ended, and the United States and its cultural and financial capital, New York, are really about to set off. We are about to enter on the Broadway stage the most important decade, the 1920s, before the movies kind of scoop up a lot of Broadway's energy, and Bel Geddes is there throughout the 1920s. He works with people like Eugene O'Neill. He works with other major, Cole Porter, Eugene O'Neill, Florence Ziegfeld. He's doing high theater. He's doing popular theater. He's the Broadway theater costume, set, and lighting designer of the 1920s. He also tries to create a production of Dante's Divine Comedy, done exclusively with light. Bel Geddes is a major figure of what is called the new stagecraft. It is a kind of theater that is coming from Europe and is a theater not of reality, but of abstraction and idea. And this is perfect for Bel Geddes, who sees all design, from theater to products to the Futurama exhibition. This is perfect for someone like Norman Bel Geddes, who of course sees theater as transformative and something that will change your lives. So he tends to create sets that are theoretical in some ways and are very much based on light and on moving parts. He also, like at Futurama, is not only designing the set, the lighting, and the costumes, the holistic environment, but he's designing the building it goes into. Of all the projects he does, the Divine Comedy never, as it turns out, happens. There's records at the Ransom Center where his archive is located. Even in the 50s, he's trying to sell it to Cinerama Projections. It never happens, as it turns out. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, characteristic of Bel Geddes. There's always this fluctuation between the real and the fantasy. So this is the Divine Comedy set on the left, and this is the theater that he designs for it that will house it. He's also interested in bringing modern theatrical devices like moving parts, moving sets, parts of the set that will move and fly into the flies and move to the side. And again, like the Futurama exhibition that has a major moving part, the conveyor belt, so does a theater he proposes in which you'll notice on the lower left, there's a group of rocks that is a stage set and a group of tracks. The idea would be that the audience would sit in this auditorium, that the set would then move in the basement, and then by hydraulic elevators move up. In many ways, I think he's anticipating what's happening in the movies. He's watching what movies are able to do with kind of quick scene changes, and he's trying to anticipate in the theater the kinds of effects that are possible easily in the movies. By the late 1920s, even the New York stage isn't big enough. So if LA is not big enough in the teens, the New York stage is not big enough. And he becomes very frustrated. Some of his most radical ideas on stage sets are not realized, or they're realized, but the plays are not successful. And in the late 20s, with another group of designers like Raymond Loewy and Walter Darwin Teague, he moves into the field of industrial design. Interestingly, the link in Bel Geddes' career are a series of store windows that he designs for Franklin Simon, a Fifth Avenue department store. And he says he designs the windows and he designs the mannequins. The mannequins are oftentimes made of glass and they have neon inside of them. Must have been a great sort of effect. But he, once again, puts these windows in the terms of the theater. And he says, well, the show window is a theater on the street, and the mannequin is the performer, and I'm basically telling stories to convince people to buy things. So the role of narrative, which you see in Futurama, is depicted very early in these little store windows. These now lead to a plethora of products that he designs throughout the 1930s. He does an early example of stove design. This is one of the first stoves that is not a kind of a cast iron stove, but an iron or a steel frame that has porcelainized panels attached to it. Bel Geddes does an early example of that. He does a plastic radio. He does all kinds of ashtrays. So he does an enormous amount of product design in the 1930s. Even in automobile design, he fluctuates between the real and the fictional. And of his many designs for vehicles, only automobiles come close to being fully realized. As I said earlier, he does designs for flying airplanes and streamlined ocean liners, and I'll show you in a minute the roadable plane it's called. The only two products that come close to being realized in the realm of transportation vehicles are two car designs. On the left, he's hired by the Graham Page Company, Detroit-based automobile company in 1928, to create an automobile. Remember, this is when General Motors is developing style changes, and Graham Page is wanting to get into that market. So the idea was that on the left, in 1928, you would release motor car number 1. And Bel Geddes always names his cars because, again, this is a futurist. There always is going to be another number. It's never going to stop. It's going to be very continuous. So this is motor car number 1, which was to be introduced in 1928. At the same time, Bel Geddes was asked to design motor car number 5. And motor car number 5 would be introduced around 1933. So the public would see elements of motor car number 5 in motor car number 1. They would get used to it. They would go to motor car number 2 when more features would be introduced, motor car number 3, 4, and 5. As it turns out, even motor car number 1 was too radical for the Graham Page Company, and the car never went ahead. However, Belgedis didn't stop, and on the right is motor car number 9, a fictitious car that's done for nobody, but he figured since he was up to 5, he might as well go to 6, 7, 8, and 9. There's almost no change between 8 and 9, but that's a model of motor car number 9. And as you see, this was his supposed ultimate car. It's circa 1933. It has a rear-end motor, because that would allow that kind of teardrop shape where the body of the car comes down and you get that teardrop streamlined shape. The other thing it allows is you don't have that pesky problem of looking out the front window and seeing the landscape over the hood. You have a total immersion in the landscape because the front is perfectly sheer. You're right in the landscape. And of course, the wraparound window also gives you that kind of panoramic view of the landscape. Now, this car was very much the embodiment of streamlining. Streamlining, which Norman Belgedis was described in one newspaper ad as the man who streamlined America. This is an article by him in which he discusses the principles of streamlining and a drawing to the right of how air moves behind streamlining. Streamlining was a process that industrial designers like Henry Dreyfuss and Raymond Loewy, Walter Darwin Teague, they latch onto this idea of streamlining. There's a depression, there's a recession in the late 20s, which causes American business people to look for new ways to market their products. And streamlining and style are one of the ways this is going to happen. They're advised to do this by a series of articles in various magazines. With the coming of the Depression then in 1929, this idea of juicing up sales through style, which we live with today, of course, with style changes, is really embedded in the American idea. So that designers see streamlining as a style, but they also see it as a process. It isn't just the form. They see it as a process by which products will streamliningly move from the design studio to the manufacturing facility, to the showroom, to the reception by the public. So it's got a metaphoric as well as a formal dimension to streamlining. The symbol at the time of streamlining, the image of it, was the assembly line off of which Henry Ford's Model T cars would roll and go across every American city. And we saw some of that yesterday, those famous films that were shown all over the world of the Model T and the cars, the Ford cars coming off the assembly line. This was the symbol of how products would go through the process of manufacturing and reception in America. The second automobile that Belgedis is involved in has very much to do with the theme of streamlining. In 1933, Belgedis was contacted by Walter Chrysler to do last-minute styling of the company's soon-to-be-released Airflow, a kind of a streamlined masterpiece. And although Belgedis was only involved in modifications of the car's hood, he would actually do a series of designs for Chrysler. As it turns out, the Airflow was not a success, and as a result, the model car he did on the lower left, which was meant to be introduced in a few years, does not go forward. So both of these ideas do not happen. Interestingly, it is known that Ferdinand Porsche went to the Chrysler facility in 1936 when he was designing the Volkswagen, and in many ways, what Walter Chrysler and Belgedis wanted to have happen, in this case with the Airflow, and did not go forward in America, did go forward with the Volkswagen Beetle after the war with its streamlined body, its rear engine, and its low price. So there is a kind of transference. This is a Belgedis idea for what he called the roadable airplane. It's an airplane that flies and then it lands, the wings come up, and it becomes an automobile. By this point in time, Belgedis is a major celebrity. This is the Detroit newspaper, the Detroit News. It's a peep into the future by the spectacular Norman Belgedis. We see some of his products, including his cars. He had published a book called Horizons in 1932, which makes him the streamlined king. He's even the subject of articles, cartoons in the New Yorker magazine. The ad on the cartoon on the lower right is a gentleman at a board meeting saying, well, gentlemen, I don't care what we do with our next product, but our next biscuit must be designed by Norman Belgedis. So back to the Futurama exhibition. These are some of the car designs that appear on the model. The model cars are in all different scales because, again, as the idea was, as it was going down and up, you had to change the scale of the cars to suggest a scale change. The most spectacular moment of the Futurama exhibition occurs at the end. The last view from the armchair is this intersection. You come down towards it, your chair swivels, and you walk out onto a real, fully furnished, fully, of course, by General Motors, automobile-friendly, double-decker environment, a city of the future. So you actually have gone now from fiction to reality. And as you left, you got this button, I have seen the future. Now, what is the legacy of the Futurama exhibition? One is a phenomenal series of photographs. I mean, he was a publicity hound, and the model is lavishly photographed. This was some kind of a joke photograph called an Easter egg hunt, in which eggs were hidden on the model and children were photographed, and the photograph appeared in Easter editions of various newspapers across the country. The Futurama models did travel. GM had a thing called the Parade of Progress, in which parts of it traveled around the country. But this was not as successful as Bill Geddes wanted. He proposed this idea, where there would be trailers built and would travel around the country and then tented. He even proposed as a kind of after the war, a kind of a Cold War effort, that it would fly across the world as a symbol of America, coming to you by Zeppelin. Bill Geddes did do some architecture for General Motors. He proposed this GM consumer building, where he takes the moving pedestrian idea of the Futurama and turns it into a series of Frank Lloyd Wright-like Guggenheim Museum ramps. He proposes this in the late 1940s. This project never happens. Now, there is another aspect to the Futurama exhibition. The architect Eero Saarinen worked in Bill Geddes' office in New York in 1938. In the spring of 1938, through as always, a Yale connection. And he worked on the Futurama building. We know that, and many of the kinds of streamlined forms that you see in Bill Geddes' populist kind of modern architecture will, in the 50s, carry on in the work of Eero Saarinen. The General Motors Technical Center, when it is being designed by Eliel Saarinen in control of the office, looks very much like the Futurama exhibition pavilion in its streamlined forms. That's at the top. And later in Saarinen's work, extravagant modernist structures like Dulles Airport and, of course, TWA are on that frequency of modern architecture, that populist frequency that Saarinen will work within. The General Motors Technical Center is the more Miesian, more minimalist, but colorful strain of modern architecture. But Bill Geddes, like Eero Saarinen, will both go into this more populist, more Miami Beach style, and in many ways, Saarinen does do that. Another aspect of the Futurama is Bill Geddes writes a book called Magic Motorways. Everything with Bill Geddes is magical and futuristic, in which he presents his own ideas of the interstate. This is 1940, and you can see it's remarkably close. If you look at it closely, he's got it kind of there. He has the nerve in 1940 to write to President Roosevelt. And he sends him photographs of the Futurama, and he says, "Dear President Roosevelt," he says something like, "I'm sure you've been following the press I've been getting. And I am here to help you with the development of an interstate." And Bill Geddes does sit on a panel, a commission, dealing with the interstate. As we know, the interstate is not actually built until the 50s as a kind of a Cold War effort. So, in conclusion, as I've tried to show, Bill Geddes was always a few years ahead of everyone else in his thinking and in all of his projects. Whether he was designing a theater set, an office interior for the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency, a car, or a totally auto-centric world of tomorrow, Bel Geddes convincingly demonstrated, and these were his words, he proclaimed, quote, "A dream is an idea to be translated into a reality." Thank you very much.